Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this, I believe, the 12th ASSAf Presidential Roundtable. It is such an awesome privilege for me to be sitting in the hot seat of sharing this webinar. I send you apologies from Professor Stephanie Burton, our interim president, who would have been the person to have hosted the meeting. Unfortunately, due to some personal challenges, she's unable to be here this morning and has asked me to sit in her stead. So, colleagues, just a word or two about the Presidential Roundtable before I introduce the topic at hand. So, several years ago, when we were discussing how best it would be for us as the Academy to reach out to all and sundry, the so-called public, the general public, we came up with the idea of a presidential roundtable where the president would host a meeting and try to interface more closely with the general public. Most of our webinars are thematic based that target particular discipline-specific groups of interest. And then we have another special lecture also hosted by the president, which is Science for Business. And in that series, we try to target, collaborations with people in business. But this special roundtable is intended to deal with issues of concern at the national level that affects one and all. And we've had some very, very stimulating discussions in the past. So my colleague Renata has just reminded me that this is the 12th roundtable, and as such, we can't believe how quickly time has gone by. But for today's discussion, we have a very special topic on the perspectives on the quality of life and well-being of the elderly in South Africa. With time, we are living longer, modern medicine and qualities of life, etc., have improved for some of us, but not for all. And I think today that the discussion that our esteemed colleagues are going to walk us through are going to talk on some of the points that affect the quality of life and well-being of the elderly. I joked earlier with everybody to say that I am in that category now, but I'm still I'm still trying to operate with due functionality. So, colleagues, today we are very, very privileged to have in our midst some very exciting speakers. I'm going to kind of name them, I think, in the order in which they are going to engage with us. The first is Professor Crain Soudien, who is not a newcomer to the ASSAf family. He's featured prominently in many of our activities. He is currently an Emeritus Professor, Education and African Studies at the University of Cape Town, but he has served in several other roles, and more details of his bio can be seen in the attachment. He's a sociologist and served as a former Deputy Vice Chancellor for Transformation and Student Affairs at the University of Cape Town. And then subsequent to that, he served as Chief Executive Officer of the Humanities Sciences Research Council. Within ASSAf, he had chaired the Standing Committee of the Humanities and currently is involved very, very intricately with the Humanities Book Award. And it is always a pleasure to listen to that committee deliberate on issues, how they go and they tackle the review process for the book award. So welcome, Crain, and we're looking forward to listening to some of your thoughts on the subject. The other speaker is Professor Elena Moore, who's a professor of sociology at the University of Cape Town. And she also has an illustrious career in family caregiving of older persons in Southern Africa. And she's a recipient of the Distinguished Teaching Award 2021, as well as the Vice Chancellor Social Responsiveness Award at the University of Cape Town. So welcome to you, Prof Elena Moore, as well. And our third speaker is Ms. Femada Shamam, the CEO of the Association of the Aged. And she's done a hell of a lot of sterling types of works. And so we are also excited to have her in our midst. And she is the CFO of this Durban-based nonprofit organization. So colleagues, welcome to all three of you. We look forward to your opening statements on the panel. And after that, we will have question and answers discussion. And we invite the participants who have joined us as well. Welcome to you all. And please use the Q&A to post your questions. And my colleagues will help me at the end to go through that, and we'll bring it in to the panel for discussion. So over to you, Crain, to kick us off on the discussion on the topic perspectives on the quality of life and well-being of the elderly in South Africa.
Thank you very much, Nimla, and thank you for asking me to be here with you. Morning, colleagues. So I'm going to run you through a very short presentation, which hopefully highlights some of the major issues which we are having to confront in thinking about the elderly. So the first point to make is that we are now what would be described as an aging society. Any population, any country that has a segment of its population larger than 7% over the age of 60 is regarded as aging. We're aging. We're not aged yet. And there are many countries in the world that are in that bracket, which have large segments of their population that are aged. And the most important of these, of course, is Japan, where something like 28% of the population is aged. But there are big issues always with these questions of aging. But they become particularly acute in a country such as ours, where inequality levels are high. And so where inequality levels are high and you have elements of your population that are particularly vulnerable, such as the aging, you're faced with very distinct kinds of challenges. So we have a very distinct set of challenges here that are different to a country such as Japan or countries such as Italy, the UK, where social welfare is very much more extensive than ours is. Next slide, please. Okay, that's one. Thanks. I'll go through these quickly, Kotso. So what this slide is indicating coming out of the 2022 census is that we're approaching the 10% mark of the proportion of elderly. So next slide. And the interesting thing about this population, this aging population, is that up to 61% of them are female, and that figure is rising. So now if you take a kind of intersectional view on what is going on here, the issues are quite dire. And you can see how particular provinces are carrying the brunt of this in very, very marked kinds of ways. Next slide. Important in thinking sociologically about older people here is that 1/4 of them are what is defined as chronically poor. More than half of older people, and this is in the midst of all of these extraordinary household characteristics of South Africa. And let me just throw one in here, which is cognate, but different. Only a third of our children in this country live in households that have male figures in them. Only a third of our children, fathers are living with them. Now, here you flip that and you talk about older people. Approximately half of our older people in this country live in households. So half of older persons live in households where there are no employed people. I mean, can you just get your heads around that? Half of older people, no employed people in those households. And what those households have as features of how they manage is a dependence on social grants. Now, social grants are really important in South Africa. And our Gini coefficient, which is in the high 60s, and we have a debate in the sociology and economics community about what that figure actually is. But 73% of older people in our country are the beneficiaries of old age grants. Next one, please. So here's access to healthcare, and I imagine that both our colleagues who are following me, who are very much more involved in this whole sector, will say very much more about these features of what the experience of old age people are like. But less than a quarter of older people in South Africa in 2021 were members of medical aid schemes. So medical aid coverage was highest for older white persons. Up to 3/4 of white people, people classified white, have access to medical aid, and only 5.4% of people who are Black. Next slide, please. So this slide here comes out of a newspaper report on a survey conducted by the FNB on retirement very recently. And what this survey reveals, and these are people who are banked, is that entry segment over 60s, that is people who have incomes up to 3,000 Rand, are spending 46% of their income on groceries. Lower income segments of the respondents in the survey are less likely to have retirement plans in place. Striking also is the number of over 60s, the percentage of over 60s who are continuing to work full-time, 38%. 25% of fully retired people do not earn an income. Strikingly again, 30% of over 60s are retired, but are drawing, are depending on what we might call secondary incomes. Next slide, please. Another really significant feature of the circumstances of the elderly is that 53% of elderly people are living in extended households. Now, this is significant, but also a strength in some ways, because they are likely in those households, except of course older people are subject to abuse, and I don't have the statistics on this, but newspaper reports around all of this have been quite dramatic. Many of you will remember the story about this young man in the last 2 weeks in the Western Cape here, who the drug problem severely beat up his grandmother, and so, you know, while there's likelihood of support, there's also likelihood of the possibility of things going wrong. The significant thing about these extended households is the large number, over 10%, 12.4%, of older people who are living in what is described as skip households. In other words, there aren't 3 generations in the household, there are only 2 generations, the oldest and the youngest. The middle generation isn't there. And so this dependence on young people is a really interesting feature of who we are as a country. Next slide. This is an elaboration of the previous point that I was making, and gives you a sense of the number of the proportions of people classified coloured and people classified African who are living in extended households and in skip generations. Next slide, please. So we made the point earlier about social grants. About 3.5 million people over the age of 60 are receiving social grants, particularly old age grants. It's important to note how small these old age grants actually are. While they obviously make a difference in people's lives, the discussion about how much people are being supported is a really important one. Next slide. So one of the distinct things which comes out of work that we've been doing in the HSRC and which features in our recent book on well-being is this question of intergenerationality and solidarity between generations. So a study, it's an ongoing study that began in 2007 by a colleague of mine in HSRC, Monde Makiwani, of older people, revealed that 84% of people surveyed felt that they said that they felt lonely at least some of the time. A lot of these people are living in communities, particularly rural communities, where there is neglect, isolation, and a decline in the quality of life. Thanks. Next slide. And they depend on remittances. Now, remittances, again, talking about distinct features of South African, the sociology of South African households. Most rural households depend on remittances. So we made the point earlier about what proportion of older people find themselves in households. And so here we're making the point that most rural households depend on these remittances. The work that we did here with Monde is an attempt to describe how these remittances work and the vulnerability of these transmission methods which bring the remittances into households. And there are really very poignant stories there about the innovative ways in which people are seeking to make life for themselves and to support their quality of life through these very innovative methods. Next slide, please. And so to come then just to the end of this short presentation, this is an indication of the percentage of households receiving remittances. Now, there's no pattern here, because no pattern between rural and urban, because you'll see that Gauteng is most dependent on remittances. The big rural populations, rural provinces such as KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape have pretty high proportions of households that are dependent on remittances, but there's a clear variability in what is going on in particular provinces in terms of their dependence on this. Last slide now, please. So the last point to be making is, and I'm sure my colleagues will elaborate on this, we don't have significant policy measures in place for older people. So the major policy that we have was developed in 2005 after South Africa signed the political declaration adopting the Madrid International Plan of Action on Aging. However, outside of the limited parameters of the Older Persons Act of 2006, no further policy or legislation has been developed to address these gaps. And little of the plan critically has been implemented. There's also little acknowledgement or provision for the particular needs of older people in health, mental health. The vision of the National Development Plan is to increase life expectancy from 61 to 70. But, and I end with this, we have no clear strategies on how the Department of Health or the Department of Social Development will meet the health needs of an aging population. Thank you very much. Thanks, Simla.
Thanks, Crain, for giving us the sober information on the circumstances of the elderly. But let's now hear what Prof Elena Moore has to add to the conversation, and then we will pick up other specifics. Over to you, Elena.
Fantastic. Thanks to the team for inviting me. And as I've been introduced, I'm Elena. I am leading the Family Caregiving of Older Persons in Southern African program. I'm going to say a little bit about that, and I'm also going to think through these questions that have been posed for us. I mean, we probably need to start by wondering, what does well-being or happiness mean to older persons in South Africa? What is a good life for an older person today? How would we conceptualize it? How do older persons conceptualize it? And how might you measure it? What are the kinds of accounts that people share with us as we listen to over 100 older persons, not only in South Africa, but also actually across the region in Malawi, Namibia, and Botswana? And what kinds of issues, challenges, joys, are people sharing with us as part of this research? So what I've tried to do, we only have 10 minutes today, I'm aware of that. I've tried to group together some of the findings that have been coming out of our work. I'm going to explain our work now in a bit. And I'm going to take us through, I think, 4 major points that I see, ways in which the well-being of older persons are impacted through different mechanisms. I'm going to talk about the enabling environments, or what a concept used often to think about how people can go about their everyday lives, older people can go about their everyday lives, and how the context structures what we can and can't do. I'm going to talk a little bit about the shortcomings of social protection that's offered here in South Africa. And in addition to that, I'm going to briefly touch on complex health conditions and the changing nature of those in multiple care contexts in the households that actually Professor Soudien has just alluded to. And in all of that, I'll argue and I'll pay a bit of attention to the ways in which there's actually quite limited external support of different kinds that's needed. And there are many recommendations that will be alluded to. I probably won't have time to go into all of them. So just first to say that we are in the Family Caregiving Program, we are working across 4 countries, in Malawi, Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa. And we're working as a larger team with 3 major components. We have an extensive multi-sited longitudinal qualitative study taking place, as I said, in these 19 sites across these different countries, in which we're talking to and listening to older persons and their caregivers at a household level, at a community level. And in addition to that, doing extensive kind of work reviewing budgets and policies, etc. But we've also got this extensive public engagement program where we're trying to improve the spaces where conversations about policies for older persons can be had, to perhaps co-construct some of the conversations in terms of what has certain evidence generated to make us think that these are particularly important questions. All of this is done to try and assist and help and think about the well-being of older persons. So just to allude, we are working within South Africa, we're working across KwaZulu-Natal. We're partnered with Femada and TAFTA, and we're partnered with over 60 NPOs working within the country. We're a team of about 40 researchers, as I said, in total working with over 330 families. So in South Africa, we're in KwaZulu-Natal, Western Cape, and the Eastern Cape. And we have a range of findings already. We started in 2023 with a 5-year program. It hopefully will be extended. And our findings, I'm pulling today on different parts of our findings that can be found in these reports on our website. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is what I'm referring to as disenabling environments. We're quite aware of, many of us here are aware of the social model of disability. But before we get to that, we got to think of who are older persons. Now, Professor Soudien has already alluded to this. But if I were to say to you, if we think about older person grant beneficiaries, the 75% of the older person population who have higher income needs and have access to lower incomes and face different sets of vulnerabilities and challenges. So with thinking about this as sociologists, we think, well, whilst the idea of well-being may be subjective well-being, and there are social structures that shape our well-being. And so all of us in the room, I'm sure today, know the history of the country, the way in which Black South Africans in particular have been disenfranchised, have been disadvantaged across many decades, both in colonial and apartheid eras. And so today, the older person population has had a life course and a life history of those experiences. Now, if we look at the population today, we see that approximately 1/3 of older persons are living in KwaZulu-Natal. I say 1/3 of the older person grant beneficiary population, which is different than the entire older person population. 75% of older persons receive the older person's grant. 80% of these persons who receive older persons are Black. And as Professor Soudien alluded to, we know that there are more than twice as many women older person grant beneficiaries as men, and there's different reasons for that. Women live longer. They also have access to lower levels of income. So there's and there are more women in the country than there are men. But women live longer in poorer health, and so they're living with particular needs. The health needs are quite stark and quite vivid in South Africa. 1 in 4 people have diabetes. Almost 3/4 of the population are living with hypertension. And these conditions, the rise in non-communicable diseases such as cancers and strokes, leave people in a situation where they're living with a disability where they require care. Now, the question of who provides that care is a key question. So one thing we know, that housing and access to basic services is a critical issue in how people live their everyday lives. Is housing available? First question. Who's it available to? Is it available to older persons? What's the private rental sector like for older persons? What percentage of them are actually renting? If housing is uninhabitable, or if it's inaccessible, what does that mean for an older person who's living with a particular condition or living with a particular disability? If there are mobility challenges for example, and they're unable to access a toilet because either the toilet may be outside, or it may be that the ground is uneven from their own home to get to the toilet. And so there are all these restrictions and challenges that are about the environment, not just about, that are not individualized to the person, but they're about the way in which the landscape and the social context in which the place where people live and older persons live, constrain and construct how that life is lived and ultimately how well-being is impacted. So there's lots of figures we can throw out here. For example, 63% of older person households have access to piped water. But that means that 1/3 of older persons don't. Who helps them to get water if they're unable to get water themselves? What is the care work that is involved in that work? What is the cost? Not just the financial cost, but the time cost. What resources are needed? People are interdependent in terms of wanting to live their lives with others, but older persons living with a disability also need assistance with some of the basic activities of daily living. Now, the question about how many people, older persons, are living with disabilities that impact their ability to wash, eat, dress, walk, or get out of bed, for example, we estimate, I mean, not that we estimate, the literature evidence and the research evidence shows that, give or take, and this actual figure is largely, it's not that it's unknown, but there is a debate. There's roughly 1.5 million people of the older person population require assistance with those daily activities. So we got to think about, well, if I don't have that assistance, or if I have to negotiate that assistance, how is that going to impact my well-being, for example? What we also do in our program is we measure the cost and the time and the resources that are needed in order to access state services. That could be the SASSA office, that could be the clinic, it could be a hospital, and it could be a pharmacy. And so we map this all out in thinking about what do older people need in their environments to be able to sustain a livelihood and to ensure that they have well-being. Now, we all know the older person's grant can be largely like applauded. It has made huge inroads into ensuring older persons have a basic income. However, there are shortcomings of not just the older person grant, but the way in which the older person grant is embedded into a larger suite of social protection mechanisms and grants, basically. So on the one hand, it's the dominant form of support from the state. You know, the state heavily relies on cash transfers to meet the need of older persons. So it puts money in the hands of older persons, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the state is spending more on supporting households manage the care or do the care work. So there is a kind of understanding that families will still do that work. And those, in many households, the conditions, the kind of the care conditions of the care needs are very complex and can't always be managed by families. So relying on families to do that work in the absence of other forms of support, albeit there is a grant in aid, which is very small, and there's a very small uptake, is something that we are investigating. But that's not the only reason. The other reason why our shortcomings in the social protection suite that impact older persons' well-being is because some people get grants and others don't. And as a result, other people in the household need to rely on the older person's grant. So the older person's grant is stretched much further than may be desired. And we looked at this. We looked at this by analysing NIDS data in terms of geography, in terms of households, and I actually can't see because my thing is, we see, as Professor Soudien said, 66%, 2/3 of older persons who are receiving the older person's grant are living in multi-generational households. Those households comprise of, on average, 6 people. This is more dominant in rural areas. And those households are relying on average, 6,850 rand for 6 people. Now we know what is needed: a basic set of goods, food, electricity, money to ensure, cleaning products, etc. What is required to sustain ourselves? And 6,850 is simply not enough to manage the cost of 6 people, especially when there are school costs and other costs incurred. Now the second last point I'm going to allude to is how older persons, their health conditions and potentially living with a disability needs to be managed, understandably, but it also takes place where there are simultaneous and other care needs in the household. And I'm going to draw an example here that we allude to in one of our reports. So as I mentioned, many of the households where older persons live are multi-generation and they're large. And in this example, it's based on a household in rural KZN. The household size, if I'm not mistaken, because I can't see it, is 13 people. Now, the income in that household, there's 1 older person grant and there are 7 child support grants. Now, we can quickly do the sums and realize how much that is. The older person in the household has full-time care needs. And so 2 of the adult children need to support the older person literally 24 hours a day. But they also need to rely, to look after the children in the household in going and coming back from school and managing food, etc. They're doing that whilst trying to ensure that they can gain some extra money by doing ad hoc jobs. That may be washing clothes, that may be fetching water. So all of this work is happening at the same time. And you can see that the care need in this household is fairly large. And whilst, yes, there are adult children available to attend to those needs, the level of work is very demanding. And people in their narratives are kind of underplaying that work and are expressing situations where they're saying, I wish my daughter could get a job, or caregivers saying, I wish I could have a job because then I'd be able to provide better. And there's a high downplaying of the care work that's happening. Now, we think about that in terms of, well, what is the support that's available by the state, right? What does the state actually fund and finance and support? Now, this is a busy slide. And to get your head around it, you know, we do have a report that speaks to this, and we did work with our partners, TAFTA, on this report. If you look at the right-hand side of this slide, we see that the 98% of spending by the government is on the older person's grant. There is a small sum that's allocated to the grant and aid. I've already mentioned that it's undersubscribed, and we are investigating that. Roughly 250,000 people are receiving grant and aid. We think that should be up to, you know, 1.5 million. So all the support, or much of the support, goes on cash transfers. On the other side, on the left kind of column, you can see is the money that is spent on services, care services of different sorts. You'll see that there are roughly 80,000 older persons accessing community-based care. That can be in such service centres, there can be food, you know, there can be food, there can be recreational activities, health activities, cultural activities. But needless to say that they largely serve people who can get to that centre, or where there is a centre in that particular community. There are a small number of people, roughly 18,000 people, who are living in residential care homes. And needless to say, a lot of the residential care homes, which are subsidised by the DSD, but are actually run by NPOs, you know, are offering services that are a high cost to very, very frail people, and particularly for the state subsidies ones for people who are eligible in terms of income levels. So the state is basically funding cash transfers and is not necessarily prioritizing forms of community care support, despite the policy focus on aging in place, meaning aging in place refers to the policy preference of staying in your own home and community as you grow older. So care services for older persons is chronically underfunded. And we found, when we analysed 18 years of spending since 2006 to the current moment, that there was a 13% decrease in spending over time, at a time when the population, older person population, as Professor Soudien has rapidly increased. So in terms of my last slide, and in terms of recommendations, they're endless. The pink ones you see in the middle are all about funding, and can we have conversations with various NPO partners, with the state and Treasury about how do we think about these funding models that currently exist? Should we be raising the unit costs and subsidies for NPOs? I think that's obviously a yes, that provide critical community-based service. Should the Department of Health and the Department of Social Development be working better together to better fund home-based care and have a higher prevalence of it? What's the best way to do that? You know, we need to obviously explore why there's a low uptake of the grant and aid. You know, what are the barriers to accessing it, for example, and we are currently doing that. So there's recommendations about the funding and the financing. There's also recommendations about care and the quality of care. We call for greater collaboration across departments, but we also, we really pay attention to what is the kind of information and resources that our families are provided with when an older person comes out of hospital after having a stroke and suddenly needs full-time care. How do families manage that when they don't even know what a stroke is, or how it affects the older person or their loved one, and how they need to manage that? So a lot more information, a lot more training of some people, but also support, both in terms of respite support, like respite care, but also knowledge and understanding of how family caregivers are managing. So the better interaction between families and health. We also have a range of recommendations in relation to thinking around the older person grant and what it does and what it can't do. And there is thinking about whether that should be more universal, whether it should be increased, or whether even just improving the suite of social protection grants, such as, the big call for the universal basic income, you know, how would that support older persons too? How grants work together in households, that they're not in tension with each other, but are needed to provide for the needs of all persons in the households. So I know that was hopefully a little bit on time, and apologies if I took too long. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena, and congratulations to you and your team for the sterling work that you do. This has really, really been very insightful. You know, we normally think about one issue at a time, but the way in which you presented it holistically really, really brings home the messaging of the core problems that we are facing. Well, we now move over to Ms. Femada Shamam. Over to you, and I'm sure you're going to make us weep even more so. Over to you.
Okay. All right. Is everyone seeing my screen? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. Firstly, thank you for inviting me to participate in this discussion. It's really close to my heart in terms of the kind of work that we do at TAFTA. And I'm hoping to share some insights in terms of, from a practice perspective, what we are finding on the ground in terms of the quality of life and the well-being of older persons. I'm Femada Shamam. I'm the CEO of TAFTA. Our website address is there, so if you want to know a little bit more about the kind of work we're doing, I encourage you to go and have a look at our website. So quickly, in terms of my input today, I really want to provide a very pragmatic view, acknowledging that the challenges are many in terms of what is being faced by older persons, but also to emphasize the potential strategies for enhancing well-being. My mission for today is really just to address, or rather just spotlight some of these challenges and to look at solutions as we go ahead. A little bit about TAFTA. We're a non-profit organization established in 1958. So we've been doing this work for just over 6 decades, providing care and support to older persons, predominantly in Durban, South Africa. We reach out to almost 5,500 people on a monthly basis. And this is through the provision of a basket of services, including accommodation and community care and support. In terms of accommodation, we currently housing about 1,600 people within our 13 facilities, and we support 3,500 people in the community through a range of programs and services. So let's quickly now focus on what's the current state. I'm not going to go into the demographics. We've spoken quite a lot about it, but the demographic shift certainly gives us a lot of opportunities in terms of how we position ourselves for the future. But I think one of the things we need to be mindful of, that the absolute number of 9.2% is 5.6 million people. And you know, we must just let that settle in a little bit. 5.6 million people are over the age of 60 in our current situation. We must also be mindful that people are living longer. So currently we have more than 8,400 people who are over 100 years old. So when we start thinking about the gift of longevity, we have to ask ourselves, does it come with the gift of quality of life? And unfortunately, due to a number of issues, we are finding that there are questions around the quality of life. I think when we start thinking about the key challenges, firstly, access to services and support remains uneven, and this has been spoken about already. And this is influenced by socioeconomic factors such as safety, crime, the evolving dynamics of the multi-generational families. Those kinds of things also play into the quality of life of our older persons. We also need to be mindful around the shrinking support networks due to youth migration. And here I'm not talking about migrating out of the country, but I'm talking about the movement of young people from what is traditional homes to the cities in order to pursue economic opportunities, leaving older people in their traditional homes without the kind of support networks from a care perspective. We also need to be thinking about access to health. I think that's a huge issue when we start looking at quality of life and well-being of older persons. 80% of the population in South Africa are dependent on the public health system. And while we note the strides in terms of access and affordability, the quality of care that is provided in our public health spaces really needs to be looked at. Especially from the perspective of fragmented services. On a very practical level, you will have older people going into a hospital. They will need to go to specialized clinics on day one. They're going to oncology on day two. They have to go to the eye clinic on day three, another one. So when you think about practically how older people are able to transport themselves to the hospitals, the support networks that are available to help them through the hospital process, you realize that it becomes one of the factors that hinders their good health. Okay, and sorry, I just need to go back. Multiple screens. Let's go on to the next. I think as I was preparing for this, I was trying to understand how do I group the factors that contribute to poor quality of life. And for me, the first issue is the issue around ageism. Ageism is pervasive and it influences our attitudes and leads to policies which views older people as burdens rather than as valuable contributing members. Access to services is another major issue. The issue around transportation is something that we really need to give a lot more focus on, and the insufficient integration between social and health services. The next point of concern is the inadequate support for our workforce. And here I'm talking about specifically the caregivers as well as professionals within the geriatric space. I was reading a report that was put out by Professor Moore and Dr. Kelly around older persons and the struggles of elder care. And they start off with a quote from a caregiver talking about the expectations as the person goes in. And I think this for me highlights some of the workforce challenges that we face. So we have a situation where we have low paid caregivers, but the expectations in terms of service delivery is so high that it becomes difficult to encourage people to work in this space. And that's something that we need to be addressing as well on a policy level and from the perspective of resource allocation. Essential services, and I've put this in because this is a bugbear for us, especially within an urban setting, unreliable municipal services, electricity and water. And I think Elena spoke about, the practicalities around activities of daily living. If you're saying someone needs to bath, they need to go and fetch the water. And while we have those conversations around kind of a rural context, let's talk about what's happening in terms of the urban setting as well. Specifically in Durban, we've had the floods of 2021 that disrupted our infrastructure, and we have not recovered from that. So we still have sections of our city where people don't have access to water, they don't have access to electricity. And this compounds the challenges that older people continue to face. In addition to that, it is the cost of municipal services. So the older person that receives the old age grant now has to make sure that they have enough to pay for these municipal services, which are unreliable, while at the same time trying to meet all of the other living costs. And there's only so much that they can stretch their rand. Some of the risks that we need to be mindful of is around climate change and the impacts on our older persons, where you have older people that have been dependent on subsistence farming, for example. It's easy to say, let's look at food security and encourage people to start a garden. But we've been having hectic climate situations, from droughts to storms and floods. And these are things that are impacting on the livelihoods of older persons. The second risk that I've put in there is around literacy challenges with technology. So as we move into an e-money system where we are using more and more of the digital space in terms of connecting and contracting, we have to be thinking about what this means for older persons and whether we have sufficiently prepared people for embracing this digital age, and also how are we supporting them through their learning so that they can continue to contribute. So what are some of the recommendations? There's quite a lot of things that are wrong. And like with Elena, we could write a whole thesis on the recommendations, but I think I'm just going to simplify what my inputs are going to be. Firstly, in terms of combating ageism, we have to shift our perceptions of aging to highlight value and experience. And I think when we were having a conversation as we started, I said to my colleague, Himla, that consider that your phase of life now is the best time of your life. So once you turn 60, it's the best time. What would you do with that? And I think we really have to reframe the way we think about aging. Secondly, we have to look at enhancing community involvement. Everybody has to get involved. Aging is everyone's business. As we have the gift of longevity, we have to understand that caregiving is going to be part of our narrative. Either we're going to be the recipient of care, or we're going to be the provider of care. So we have to really start getting with the program in terms of the care support that we need to provide or to receive. The next is to look at fostering business engagement. We have to start thinking about products and services for older adults. It's really, really sad that when, for example, researchers are doing research around financial products, they stop researching people after the age of 45, assuming that people after 60 don't have the need for financial products. And these are things that we have to encourage. The ageism is pervasive, even in terms of the research space. We have to promote research and evidence-based practices. And this is one of the reasons why we collaborate with academic institutions like with Alina, and I notice Professor Jaco Hoffman is also on this call, so that we can also lend to the development of knowledge in this field. We have to look at enhancing technology engagement as well to improve digital literacy and accessibility for older persons. Because if we talk about well-being of older people, we have to talk about issues around inclusion and how do we include people in the day-to-day experiences. The issue around intergenerational solidarity cannot be overemphasized. We have to facilitate dialogues between generations, and dialogues not just about younger people helping older people, but older people adding value to the lives of youth as well. And that kind of symbiotic relationship needs to be explored further. I think the issue around government accountability, I put that in because the government does have an oversight role. They have a role to ensure that the services are being rolled out. But perhaps my biggest concern is that we keep on overhauling the systems and putting in new administration at the expense of good service. So we spend a lot of money on administration, and the end result is that it comes at a cost of service delivery. And I loved reading this report on the government spending because these are the kinds of conversations that we need to be having with our policymakers. And finally, I've put in collaborative success framework. Basically, what this means is we need to set each other up for success. There are many players in this field in terms of aged care. Everyone has a role to play, and we need to be supporting each other so that there's a good outcome for older persons. I want to end quickly with this proverb that I came across as I was preparing for this, and it says, "Not everyone who chased the zebra caught it, but who caught it chased it." And I put this in because the challenges that we experience within the sector can seem insurmountable, but not doing anything is not an option. Everyone has a role to play, and every one of us need to be chasing zebras. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Femada. I guess, colleagues, all three presentations were presented with such distinction and eloquence that the messages have reached home far and wide. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I now open up the floor for discussion, questions and comments and input from participants. Over to you. Please direct your question and to which speaker you would like to address the question.
Hi,
Oh.
morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, Jane, over.
Hi, morning. Thank you very much. I just wanted to reply to the one comment in the chat that I think in the South African context, the correct word probably to use is older persons, because this is the word that is used in legislation that relates to people 60 plus. So that would just be a one thing. The other comment I wanted to talk about is I actually run an NGO called Go, 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 Go. And we are an NGO that is aimed specifically at building capacity and skills and knowledge and supporting grandmothers who are raising the over 4 million children in South Africa that are being raised by grandmothers. And we're very keen to work with partners and research partners. I have a research background. I am also working at the South African Medical Research Council. But we are very interested in looking at ways that we can work with partners to strengthen these grandmothers in their role as caregivers. We have expanded as well to Mkhulu, so grandfathers, and we have a number of projects where we do internet training for grandmothers. We have boxing programs. We run gobinars for mental health. We run sexual reproductive health conversations for grandmothers and grandmothers on how they can talk to the grandchildren they're raising about sex. So really looking at mobilizing this population of older persons who are very committed and loving carers and still very strong part of the community into a role of change agents. And how can they change behaviors in the children that they're raising themselves and their communities?
Fabulous. Thanks for that insight, Jane. Let's take a few more comments and then we'll ask our panelists to reflect on these. Malebo, are you ready to go?
Yes, I'm ready. I'm ready. Can you let me check my sound? Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you clearly.
Am I audible? Okay, I just want to make a general input about the elderly, the today elderly, that is the 70s and 80s, in around those ages. In one of the presentations, they said 1/4 are chronically poor and they depend on social grants. There are no policies for older people. So I just want us, all of us, to look at this, the aged people. These people, they are formerly marginalized. They were oppressed. They were underprivileged. There were no libraries, no proper education. So what do we do today to implement corrective measures? Because when you look at the upcoming aged, I'm one of them, maybe on their 30s, 40s, 50s, they are working class. They look like they are 20 because they are knowledgeable. They know how to eat well. They exercise. They have plans. They have sound mental health. So I'm thinking generally an education system has to be changed. We need to empower the today young people so that when they are in their elderly age, they know what to do. They are empowered, they have knowledge, they know about exercise, they know about planning financially. They are empowered. We need to empower the young people in order to prepare them for age years. And in that way, we also grow the economy. We know that a lot of people will be independent, not depending on government. So a lot has to be done today for tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Those are very wise recommendations. Angela?
Okay, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. And yes, pertinent topic indeed. I'm going to share 3 points. The first one is that I'm based within a university, UKZN, School of Education, and we have service learning programs. And I know that throughout South Africa, there are universities that integrate service learning within the particular modules. Now, there are always times, and I would say there are always plans for placement sites where our students can actually engage in their service learning in the placement sites. And I'm fully aware that some of our students have been placed at TAFTA, different spaces within the Durban TAFTA scene. And what is really important is if they're education students, they obviously cannot do occupational therapy. They cannot do any physiological type of or any medical type of activities. And yet, in an old age home in Claremont, for example, the students engage the elderly in reading, engage them in beading, in drawing, in a whole lot of different types of activities. And the elderly were so, the older persons were so enthralled and looked forward to the students actually coming to those times when it was organized. That's the one. The second one is that we have an eThekwini Service Learning Forum, which actually starts now at 12 o'clock, and it goes on every Wednesday from 12 to 1 o'clock, where different people within communities, whether it's an NGO, whether it's industry or academia, whatever, they present on their particular organizations and what it is that we together can look at and how we can enhance teaching and learning engagement amongst our communities. And it's really in how we work with our communities for enhancement. And then the last one is to say that this is a really pertinent issue and a really pertinent topic to be discussed in schools of education, in actual fact, in universities. And I love the comments that were made earlier on as well, and obviously the presentations. There is so much that our young people, when they are engaged and there are constructive activities for them to be working with, I could say they'll be less destructive. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you very much for those. And also, I want us to send a special welcome to those people who have been introducing themselves, who are representing organizations or other sectors. It's really, really a pleasure to have you on board and to have you participating in this webinar. So, panelists, we have had three, primary interventions by Jane, Malebo, and Angela. If you'd like to comment specifically to these, Craig, would you like to kick off?
Yes, thanks very much, Imla. So I'll leave it to our colleagues like Femada and Lena, who are much more immersed in the texture of what we're doing here. But I just want to make a broad comment, and this is in response to Malebo, that just thinking about our community of sociologists and social workers and people generally in the social sciences, how preoccupied we have been for a long time with young people. Now that's not incorrect. I'm a sociologist essentially of youth. It's not correct at all, but it really is clear how easily, and I want to thank Femada for raising this point, how our disciplines are marked by the problems of our broader society, our disciplines themselves. So sociology as a field is, and I'd like to say psychology too, and social work maybe less so, is struck by its blind spots. There are blind spots in the ways in which it comes to look at our society and to make sense of what our society is all about. So we are now, and this is my big point, we are now called upon, we are required to be able to tell the story of this complexity of who we are as a country. And that complexity, and we've got to put funding into this, the funding into the kind of work that Elena is doing, funding which shows what the difficulties are, but also critically what the successes are. And the successes are absolutely crucial. We want to know, Jane, what good practices are emerging and how we come to scale up those practices and begin to, work critically to infuse those practices into our policy repertoires. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done here. And Malebo, to say to you that you're not going to get silver bullets here. It's really a moment in which we confront where we are as a country and begin to realize just how big this marginalization of older people as a problem is, and the urgency of us stepping into that field with some of the same kind of vigor that I think that we have been dealing with the questions of young people. So I'm going to stop there. Thanks very much, Vimla.
Thanks, Crain. Elena, you first and then Femada.
Thanks. And thanks for the comments and the questions and the additions and the introductions. I think I'll just speak to Malebo's for like the point now that Professor has just raised. The thing is, there's been a lot of work actually on older persons in research in academia over the last 4 or 5 decades. And it's just not necessarily called social gerontology. It's not necessarily called a focus on this. It's hidden in other. So much of the HIV work, done in the 90s, we're sending out kind of warning signals much earlier on to say, grandmothers, and this obviously relates to some of the points that are being raised in Jane's work. Grandmothers are playing a critical role in all households in relation to care. Obviously, in that context, is with relation to the HIV/AIDS, pandemic at the time. But they were signaling that what happens when that's no longer possible. And there was great scholarly work done in that time, as well as. But there was no political will. There was very little political will, or maybe not enough advocacy work not enough advocacy work, but the volume wasn't heard, basically, is what I'm trying to say. So, Malebo, there are policies, and there are reforms of policy, as Femada has just put in the chat, that is underway. There's actually quite a large uptake and now momentum on more players, more stakeholders getting involved in trying to think about the nitty-gritties of the policies. So there's like critiques of the Older Persons Act that you can read that are really, really helpful. And yes, the older persons have a high rate of poverty, but remembering that the Older Persons Grant, South Africa has done really well, in providing such, and I say generous, I say it like in inverted commas, which is almost universal. It reaches most lower income households, most older persons, so there, it's that. It's often seen in isolation of all the other demands in the household, all the other demands in the community, all the other phenomena that are happening at the same time. And therefore, it's not understood in a comprehensive way by policymakers, by government, by others. And that's our job, is to make those connections, the complexities, as Professor has just mentioned, to kind of illuminate those and to raise those issues. I don't have any other comments for Jane and Angela. I think, Jane, I'd like to see the boxing programs. I'd be very keen to participate in some of them. But I think we need to, like, the change behavior rhetoric is a little bit dangerous. I think some of the rhetoric that it circulates at a political level is about failing families, right? And whether that's daughters who are getting pregnant, or whether it's sons who are on drugs, or whether it's, crime-ridden, this, that, or the other. And we need to make sure that these practices or these phenomena are understood in a social context, a historical context, and a social context that doesn't necessarily justify them per se, but makes sense of them as systemic problems rather than individualized to this family and this particular person. And I think that's a really important point, because otherwise we play in the hands of, at times, a very conservative political regime who don't necessarily want to support a much wider social protection suite. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Elena. Femada.
Okay, thank you. Just a couple of points. I think I just want to pick up on HIV/AIDS. We didn't even get a chance to touch on that. But, you know, in South Africa, we've got about 2.5 million HIV positive individuals that are not on ARVs. 1.5 million of those are over the age of 50. So if we're looking at projecting in terms of the kind of resource provision we need to be looking at, those numbers become quite important for us to think about in terms of access to health. But, you know, I loved the conversation, and I like also the tone where people are saying, I want to put my hands up and I want to share what I'm doing and I want to get involved, because I think this whole idea around partnerships, collaborating, and understanding that each one of us that sits at the table brings a certain amount of value, that together that system will move us to a different narrative around aging. So from a practice perspective, we are at the cold phase. We are watching the way these social issues manifest and present itself. We need someone to help us tell those stories. We need the researchers to quantify it so that when we speak to a policymaker, we are able to use evidence in terms of the way we advocate. And researchers will need the stories to be able to add value to the numbers, you know. So I think there is the symbiotic relationship in terms of all the different role players, and we have to be working together in order to get a good outcome. So I've also made a note, Angela, I'd love to have a conversation with you around your program that you run on a Wednesday. So please reach out to me and we can speak a little bit more about that and look at ways in which we need to engage. I think maybe my last point is we need to have a different energy about aging. When we start talking about aging, we can't get all sad and somber about it. If we can't get excited about the possibilities of how we can express ourselves and embrace our lived experience, we are never going to be able to convince anybody else that this is a good thing, that aging is a gift. And, you know, we're privileged to reach this stage. So it really starts off with each one of us embracing our own stereotypes and our own prejudices, and then looking at a way forward. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. You all engage with such aplomb. It's so refreshing to hear, while you're standing on your feet, just respond to these with such fluency and passion. So thank you very much. Are there any other persons on the participants list who would like to share some of their experiences or something? We still have a bit of time. So Angela, is that a legacy hand or a new question? Oh, that's gone. Or still there?
Himla, there are some, I think, questions in the Q&A. I'm not sure.
Yes, no, I was going to get to that in the next 5 minutes, but I thought I'd ask people who are on the participation. Jane, did you want to respond to something that was said earlier?
Yes, I think I wanted to just respond to the general feeling that older people are not necessarily aging or elderly yet. I mean, I'm approaching 60, and I feel that there is a huge amount of work and stuff still to be done in this population. But I think when we look at, and what triggered my thoughts was the mention of the ARVs. If we're looking at non-communicable diseases, older people are living longer and longer with comorbidities like diabetes, hypertension, high blood pressure. So there is a very important health issue to look at addressing health in these older people, because not only are healthy older people cheaper for themselves, but they're cheaper for the economy, they're cheaper for the country, they're cheaper for their families. And if we look at NHI, we need to have sure that we have as many healthy people as possible in the community, because sick people are going to absolutely destroy NHI if everybody is ill. So I think the health of older people, and looking at the fact that with ARVs, older people are living much longer with HIV and other comorbidities, we need to work with this very strong and important population. Thanks.
I'm just going to go to the Q&A. Linda Smith put a comment: our society has two sides of the coin, a small, younger, in commas, old group who have time and would like to help. How can we add this as a solution to assist the older ones? That's one. Then Roxanne Jacobs thanked the presenters, had community-based services are essential and severely underfunded and often rely on the services provided by voluntary systems, informed, unpaid family caregivers. Unsustainable, and this is unsustainable. Are there any plans or recommendations around prioritizing the development of career pathways for community-based social care support services, especially considering it as a potential opportunity to combat unemployment at the same time? And then Prof Elena Moore would like to answer this question. Let's take those. One was the earlier one. Any comments, Elena?
Yeah, so I mean, the participant is right. I mean, Linda Smith is the person. You know, there are different age groups and cohorts within an older person population, and we need to remember and take that very seriously. You know, obviously statistics bracket into 60 to 65. You know, they do 5-year brackets, but we don't need to be as crude as that, needless to say. But we need to think about the heterogeneity of older persons. Many older persons are engaged in work activities and different forms of work activities, whether that's paid or unpaid. Like we've already said, many older persons are looking after kids, but they're also looking after their daughters, husbands, uncles, whatever it may be. So we have, in our sample, for example, we have lots of older persons caring for older persons. So I think the mistake is to say, you know, they're already undertaking a lot of work. I think Femada and in TAFTA, there are a million phenomenal examples of how members of her organization as older persons are engaging in a range of activities, and she can speak to that, I'm sure, better than I can. And you know, there's a real active engagement and recognition of that work, both paid and unpaid, and in terms of skills and learning. I mean, it literally will blow your mind. In terms of Roxanne, hi, first of all. And in terms of your question, I know Professor Jaco Hoffman has just left, and his work was, and I think Lona is still here. I don't know if Lona wants to speak to this particular point, but their work was running a pilot scheme initially with Gauteng, thinking about this exact question, is about how do we work around the dearth of employment amongst younger folks who and matched with knowing that so many family caregivers and caregivers are doing this work and it's unpaid and it's unrecognized. And literally within our program, we offer kind of like an email service to respond to general questions. And we're inundated at the moment with such comments that I've cared for my mom for 10 years. And now what do I put on my CV? Literally, that's a very common reoccurring kind of question. So in relation, whether the government is doing anything about this and whether there's plans, I mean, there are tentative plans. And I think, I don't know if Professor Hoffman is still here, but I think he would be better in responding to that. I see the third question, but I haven't yet read the detail. Linda, perhaps I'll pass over to Femada.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I think maybe just to add, Lona is working on the care economy, and it's exactly the issue around the career pathing and trying to understand whether we can monetize the caregiving responsibility in a way that is meaningful for the caregivers. So yeah, if Lona is still here, I'd love for her to give some feedback around that. And I think, just maybe to pick up on some of the other comments that were coming through in terms of all of the policy frameworks that we have and whether there is some changes that's coming through, like, for example, I note the questions around we have the Older Persons Act, but we still don't have the Caregivers Register. We don't have the register in terms of the offenders and all the rest of it. Absolutely, I agree. And I think we have to engage in these processes to revise and to make sure that happens. But I've put in the comment section that there are also international pressure mechanisms to force the government to act. And right now, through the United Nations, the open-ended voting of a UN Convention on the Rights of Older Persons. And like there is a UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, it then creates the framework for us to engage further. And sometimes we shy away from these processes because it's very long and convoluted, but we have to get involved and we must be able to elevate our voice and make that kind of inputs as well. Okay, I'm going to stop there. All right, is that okay?
Thank you very, very much. Angela, I believe this is
yes.
another...
Okay, so I'm so sorry. I'm here because I forwarded this to my colleague and she's now using the same link as me. So my name comes up and she would like to talk. So yes, she comes on now. Carry on.
Can you hear me
Yes,
this way?
we can hear you. Yes.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. Sorry for the complications, everybody. Okay, so I'm Jane Quinn. I'm also at UKZN, Pietermaritzburg, but I'm particularly here actually because I'm turned 65 this year, so I'm about to be disemployed and enter this kind of arena fully of a marginalized elder person. And having been an activist educator all my life, I'm diving into this existential crisis with a look at, okay, so how do I now start working in this space somehow, connecting with people? So I just really wanted to be saying, thanks so much. I'm very happy to have bumped into this webinar because there's a lot of interesting synergy. So I will not be on government pension, but I am going into this really weird place of being treated like I have to get special permission to hire a car and things now because I'll be over 65. I mean, the insults don't stop coming. But anyway, so just also I'm kind of waving a flag to say I'm here. And from my work is in critical self-reflexivity and participatory pedagogies. So I'm really keen from next year when I'm out of my working life because of my age, then to connect with people working in the space and see what to do with it from being in it ourselves also, I think is a really useful sort of consciousness raising conversation to have for how we work in it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm sure all of us have that kind of vision for the future. What happens when we get to that age when we are forced out of the working system? So keep your faith, keep your strength. There are some contact details of people that have been sharing, so you can still be in the loop for those sorts of things. But I just want to, I will go at the end and ask people on the panel for final comments. But there are a couple more comments that have featured in the Q&A. Margaret Schneider talked about the way in which disability grant falls away at the age of 60, and that it's like a double-edged sword because disability grants are necessary, and then the kind of complications that happens when that falls off, and then one is dependent on the old age grant system. There's a lot more written in that text which I'm having difficulty seeing at the moment because my glasses are blurred. But if anyone in the panel can read that and try to answer that, please, that would be kind of useful. Philemon Malinga has a hand up, so let's give that participant an opportunity, please, Renata. There we go.
Okay, now. I'm Philemon Malinga from Hearts of Compassion, which is in Kuruma, Northern Cape. And then our area is a mining area. Our core business is palliative care. But now we also incorporate the elderly and the disabled. But what I just discovered or noticed with the elderly people, most of them, they don't want to die when they don't have a good relationship with the either grandchildren or children. Now, most of them, that's how they get exploited by these grandchildren. They end up taking the grant money they get, they buy themselves cell phones, they do a lot because they threaten them. If we don't get 1, 2, 3, we will leave you and then you'll be left alone. We normally help a lot of elderly people. We find that they are staying with some more than 7 grandchildren. I remember last time we had the other old man of 88 years living with 17 grandchildren, and they were having only one shack that did not even have a foundation or even a floor. It was just an earth on. There were these children sleeping with the boyfriends in front of the old man. So now I believe if we can advocate for a policy whereby the NGOs or the CBOs that are around the elderly, if they can be capacitated to take care of them so that they don't get exploited, then they are able to take care of them, even if it goes to an extent that they are able to manage their grants for them. That will assist a lot. But what I know, and one of the things that exacerbates their situations that make them more sick is they don't want to die when they don't have a good relationship with either their children or their siblings. So to broker that relationship, to mend the relationships in between them and their either children, grandchildren, or their siblings, it tends to prolong their lives. They live life with a relative ease, without pain, without much suffering. Thanks for the
Thank you,
opportunity.
Philemon, for that
Yeah.
insight. It's very useful. And thank you for joining us all the way from Kuruman, from a mining community. Elena, would you like to respond to that? And in so doing, can you give us your 1 minute roundup, please?
Oh, that's a tough ask. Okay, so thanks for that, Philemon. And I appreciate that contribution. And I think the way in which grants have come into households, not evenly, but very unevenly, through the structure of them, what's available, who it's available to, how much is it, etc., creates tensions in households. I won't deny that, right? And those tensions are vastly different. Sometimes it's minor, and sometimes it can be quite significant, as you're pointing out too. Many older persons, like you said, they definitely want to have good relationships with their grandchildren and children towards the end of their lives. And we see how sometimes the availability of the grant, of having one reliable income source in the family, allows that to happen, but sometimes in sinister ways too. Older persons do want another place to go sometimes. That's absolutely true. It doesn't have to be necessarily a residential care facility, but there needs to be alternatives. I firmly believe that there needs to be alternatives, and our imagination collectively can think through what those alternatives are. You know, they may not be what they look like right now in terms of how you think of an old age home. Other alternatives are possible, and I think Femada and others who are doing this work on the ground, you know, can think of a whole range of possibilities there. So in terms of a final point to the last minute, I think we do need to recognize the heterogeneity of older persons. You know, everyone is vastly different and have very different starting points and very different demands and constraints on their own lives and their own bodies, you know. And in terms of Marguerite's question, I think it is a very good example, and I completely agree with you, Marguerite, of how the structure around older persons who are living with disabilities, because not everyone lives with a disability, but those who do live with a disability, their ability to access basic assistive devices such as a wheelchair, or such as crutches, or such as a commode, is not always facilitated by the health service, or not facilitated, and comes at a cost. And these are the disappointing features of our society that we need to, as Femada has been saying, we need to raise, we need to make noise about, and we need to try and think with SASSA, with Department of Health, with all the various national stakeholders about how these constraints are impacting the well-being of older persons. Thanks, Prof.
Thank you very much. Femada?
Okay, so just my last comment. I think there's just so much of wealth that's coming through in terms of the experiences. I did put in the chat that there are resources available. So the colleague that spoke about retiring at this point in time, I've put in that there are resources available. Linda Smith, I don't know if she's still here, she runs an amazing organization called 50+ Skills, and it's about preparing for your next season and embracing the next season. Amazing work. So I really would encourage people to link up with her as well around preparedness and how do you embrace the season of your life. But I think this, just picking up from what Elena's saying around the options that's available, I think we have to move away from this idea that we know all the answers. I have no idea what the solutions look like. But I do know that if you get older people at the table and you involve them in co-creating and co-designing solutions, it is more likely to work because they have that kind of practical knowledge, they have the lived experience they draw on. So I think when we're looking at solutions, my advice and maybe my last comment is to say, look at exploiting every opportunity for engagement of older persons in designing solutions for them. If you design with them, you're more likely to find things that will work and that is sustainable anyways.
Thank you very much. Crain, some last comments from you?
Yeah, no, thanks. Just one comment that I want to leave with Himle, and this is that this category of the aged, like the categories of youth, adolescence, all of these things, these are all very recent inventions. And it's really important for colleagues to come to think about how these categories coming out of Western sociology have come to structure our lives. Our planning is based around all of this. And the important point to make around this is that what the imposition of these classifications come to do for us, in the absence of us understanding properly how the experience of people that we call elderly is actually lived, makes us dependent on other people's knowledges. So we are very dependent here on northern sociologies, northern psychologies, on what's going on in the lives of people in this part of the world, where this experience of this time of their lives may actually, or in different times, may have been quite different, So all I'm saying is that we are looking at the dominance of a way of seeing here, which has come to penetrate our lives in very, very real ways. And now we have to come to terms with it. We have to come to terms with what this dominance is all about. And so I'm very keen for decolonializing all of this language around all of this, but not to be negligent of the lived reality coming out of the way in which planning processes work in our lives. And so just to make a plea to everybody, are open areas here for study, for scholarship, for scrutiny. We are at the beginning stages of understanding the complexity that is in front of us. The bulk of this conversation today has been focused on remediation in some ways, and that's not a bad thing, you know, but we need to be doing and coming at this in very much more holistic ways, very much more sensitive, but in the process, you know, talking to elderly people. So I'm elderly by all of these definitions, but I don't understand myself like that, you know. I don't. And some people say, get real with yourself, man, get real. And of course I want to be real, but we're in a really interesting moment in which we want this conversation to be much more fully, much more critically, much more self-critically for each of us in terms of understanding what's going on and how we need to be dealing with it. So thank you very much, you folks in ASSAf, for stimulating all of this. I think it's been really powerful, and I hope that we can see some follow-ups to this. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Crain. To our esteemed panelists, Professor Crain Soudien, Professor Elena Moore, and Ms. Femada Shamam, on behalf of Professor Stephanie Burton, who ought to have been in the hot seat to chair this, I wish to thank you sincerely on behalf of ASSAf for sharing with us your insights on a very, very interesting, sensitive, and very complex topic. Also to the participants who got in on the discussion, either verbally or through the chats, thank you also for giving us your time to be part and parcel of this, and for sharing your information to make contact with fellow participants. There was a question in the chat, and my colleague could so answer that we have got this recording. The recording would be shared to participants, and if the speakers give consent, we will also share their presentations. I know we have gone over time, and I'm very, very sorry, but I just could not stop the discussion when we were at the pinnacle of hearing from everybody and giving everyone an opportunity. As I said at the opening, the Presidential Roundtable is intended to stimulate a discussion on topics of interest to a wider public, and I think we have done that just today. And I wish to thank my colleagues Teboko and Kutso for working in the background to engage the participants and keeping them in touch, and to one and all for being with us. And I leave you with one plea. Reach out to somebody who is older today, or one or two people. Show them the love and the support, because sometimes that's all they're longing for, to hear from you and just to know that somebody cares. And with that, I want to thank one and all for your participation. And until we meet again, all the best, and thank you from ASSAf. Bye for now.